Hi there. It's Aaron Kirkwood, licensed associate marriage and family therapist with Counseling Associates for Wellbeing in Athens, Georgia. Thank you for joining me today. I'd like to talk a little bit about how I employ some of the information and research from the Gottman Method in my own practice with couples. And hopefully it can be instructive and impactful for your relationship. I would say that this information is not just helpful in romantic relationships, but I think it can apply to friendships, family, even relations with coworkers, any sort of relational interaction that you have where communication is important. I think that you'll find some of this hopefully helpful and interesting. So the Gottmans did some really neat stuff. They studied couples in something that has been dubbed the Love Lab. John Gottman himself refers to it as a bed and breakfast type setup. They bring couples in, they watch them for 24 hours, take lots of measurements. They look at physiological measurements like pulse rate, blood samples, urine samples, the whole deal. And what they found was pretty revealing, and I think it helps us understand what happens when we are communicating with our partner, or again, it can be anyone, and particularly when conflict arises, and that's what I'll talk about today. One thing that they did find in their research, the Gottmans, as they studied these couples in immediacy, and then they followed them throughout some years, and they looked and compared, okay, what did the couples who were happy and stayed together for a long time, what did they do well? And the couples that did not, that ended up either dissolving the relationship, or maybe they stayed together but they weren't happy, what are the things that they all seemed to do that led their relationships to be unhappy? One thing that they noticed is that as couples had any sort of conflict, you would notice that their pulse rate would increase, meaning they were becoming physiologically aroused. And so what it begins to look like is fight or flight. And so what that means in terms of conflict when you're dealing with your partner is when you become physiologically aroused, your literally your brain starts to function differently. You go into fight or flight. The blood in your body says, okay, we don't need this front part of the brain here, that part that's used for thinking and reasoning and rational. We don't need that. We just need to prepare to either fight something or get the heck out of here. So your blood kind of goes more to your extremities, your other organs, and prepares almost for battle. And so sort of the middle part of your brain that's really in charge of reacting emotionally, very strong emotional reaction sort of takes over. I often hear from couples that I work with, it's like, we start out reasonable, and then the next thing you know, we're yelling, we're saying things that we don't mean. Hey, can you help us, avoid doing that? And I say, yeah, we sure can. Yeah, absolutely. So what I do is I take those ideas that first of all, conflict is not bad in a relationship. That's what the Gottmans found, was that what they call the masters, the couples who did well over time, were not necessarily couples who did not have conflict. In fact, there were couples who maybe never had conflict for a long period of time that end up dissolving their relationship. And I guess you could think of it as being, they just didn't care enough to have conflict, and that can happen. So conflict in itself is not a measure of how good or bad your relationship is, but what they found was it's how couples sort of responded within the context of a conflict that determined if they had a happy and successful relationship. And so, what I see with couples is they sort of get in these patterns of communication where one partner just doesn't want to have conflict. They are conflict avoidant. So when something happens, there's a little bit of conflict that gets engaged in, and then they start to shut down. They want to flight. In other words, they get just over aroused. they get too emotional, and what happens is they have to escape, in order to calm down. When they do that, very often the other spouse sees this as they're not listening, they're not acknowledging, my thoughts, my feelings. The other spouse really wants to be heard. They really want to feel like their partner's engaged, and so when the partner who's feeling what the Gottmans call flooded tries to withdraw, the other partner pursues. They become more heightened. It's like, oh, you're not listening to me? You're over there ignoring me? Okay, I'm going to step it up a notch, right? And when that happens, that makes the flooded partner feel that much more overwhelmed. So what I like to do with couples is work on what I call active communication, where one person takes the role of the speaker and the other person takes the role of the listener. This is also in Gottman Method. And I say, when you are the speaker, it's very important that you describe your feelings, tell your partner what's going on with you, why something is problematic for you, but make it about you and your feelings. I often say people can argue all day long about facts, about what happened, what didn't happen. Well, you didn't run the dishwasher. You didn't take the dog out and they made a mess on the floor. No, you said you were going to take the dog out. Okay. But it's much harder to argue about feelings, right? I asked you before I left this morning if you would run the dishwasher, and then I got home and it wasn't run, and I really felt like, you weren't valuing my time because now I have to run the dishwasher, I have to cook dinner, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, I just think it's a lot harder to argue with how you feel versus, what you did or didn't do. So, as the speaker, focus on your own thoughts and feelings. Acknowledge when the other person is listening, is making an effort, and then you kind of switch off. After you've gone, taking your turn as the speaker, the other person will sort of, who is the listener, will say, okay, let me make sure I understood what you said, because what a person says, the words that they say, may or may not even be what the person physically hears, but even if they hear what they say, then they have to interpret and make sure that what they are hearing and what they are interpreting is what you meant to say. Think about a time when you may have had an argument with someone and it goes on, and you get to the end of it, and one person says, yeah, that's what I was saying, and the other person says, I know, that's what I was saying. So you had this big, long argument, this conflict, you've taken some precious time out of your relationship, and at the end, it was just a misunderstanding. That happens. So you want to check in as the listener with what the speaker, make sure that you understand what it is that they've said. You want to give them what the Gottmans would call some sort of affirmation or some sort of recognition that, okay, yeah, that makes sense. I can understand why you might feel that way. Now, saying that does not mean that you agree with what they feel in this particular situation, but it just means, hey, I'm hearing you. I'm understanding why you feel the way that you feel in this situation. And then you kind of switch. The other person can, if they need to, they can be the speaker. They can talk about their thoughts and their feelings about the situation. And then the other person is the listener, and they do the same thing. They want to check in, make sure that they've heard what the other person said, and that they really understand it. And so it kind of goes back and forth like this, and it feels silly oftentimes. And so what we do in the office is we practice, because I tell people, I can introduce these skills, these active communication skills to you, but if you don't practice, when you get in the heat of the moment of a disagreement, you get emotional. Again, the front part of your brain starts to shut down, okay, and you're just reacting. It's very hard to sit there and okay, what did he say? What am I supposed to be doing here? How am I supposed to be saying this? So we role play and we practice in session. So that's a little bit about how I interpret and how I use the Gottman Method when I work with couples, also families, and honestly even individuals. All of my work, whether I'm working with a couple, a family, or an individual, I'm always thinking about what are their relationships, how are their relationships impacting what's going on with them, and then how can they improve what they are doing to help those relationships. So I hope you found this helpful. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave those below. There'll be contact information down below, also a website for Counseling Associates for Wellbeing, as well as how you can get in touch with me. Again, thanks for watching, and I hope it's helpful.